State of the Industry podcast. And here we go. This episode is brought to you by KP Movement Education, your source for health and movement education and coaching. Whether you are a health or fitness professional, a fitness consumer, or perhaps a passive bystander, KP believes that everyone deserves the right to pain-free movement. That's why their memberships and services are designed to educate, empower, and inspire you to create a culture of movement for yourself and those around you. With 2 membership options, you'll find education surrounding developing at-home training programs for yourself or for others, mental health and exercise, lifestyle medicine, and much, much more. Check it out at kineticperformance.ca/memberships. That's kineticperformance.ca/memberships. Hey, Fit Fam, welcome back to the State of the Industry podcast. I am your host, Adam Youngsma. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with one of really the pioneers in both the personal training and the strength and conditioning fields here in Canada, Sheldon Persad. Sheldon is the co-owner of Personal Best Health and Performance, and his clientele is extended to 4 continents. Sheldon is a certified coach in several different sports and also a certified stress and wellness consultant. He's been coaching for over 30 years, and his experience includes being the coach of athletes who have competed at World Championships, the Commonwealth Games, the Pan American Games, the Olympics, both summer and winter, from close to 24 different national team programs. He is the co-founder of the Certified Professional Trainers Network, or CPTN, a co-founding director of the Canadian Strength and Conditioning Association. He's an author, an award-winning international presenter. He has twice hosted his own radio show segments, taught high-performance coaches at 2 local colleges, and spent the year leading up to the Rio Olympics as the Director of Sports Science and Sport Medicine at the Canadian Sport Institute in Ontario. Above all, Sheldon enjoys spending time with his wife and tries, like many of us, to stay in shape in an effort to keep up with his kids. Without any further ado, let's hop right into it. So welcome, Sheldon, to the State of the Industry podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. How about you, Adam?
I'm doing very well. I'm excited for this conversation. I've been trying to get, looking for the right person, I think is the best way to put it, to speak about training Olympic athletes. And you've had a lot of experience getting into developing or being a kind of developer of the CPTN and getting into the Canadian Strength and Conditioning Association. So I want to chat about that, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But can you just give the listeners a little bit of an introduction into who you are and what you do?
Sure. Again, name is Sheldon Persad. I would consider myself a coach first and foremost. Some of what I do as well is I have been a personal trainer and still am. I have been a strength and conditioning coach. I still am. I have taught at a couple of different colleges, and I've had the opportunity as well to be a facilitator within the National Coaching Certification Program over the years.
Awesome. And are you still involved in that, the developing certifications? Are you still involved in that?
With the CPTN, so the CPTN initially when we founded it was the Canadian Personal Trainers Network.
Yeah.
We eventually changed that to the Certified Professional Trainers Network. So the CPTN, we started that over 25 years ago. And initially over the first 10 to 15 years, I was heavily involved in terms of, creating the standards, creating the examination process, selecting the practical assessors and teaching not only the courses for the individuals who were taking the exam, but also the assessors. The 10 years prior, after that, I spent less time. So what I'll typically do is I'll still speak at the conferences either every second year or every third year. So for example, we had the 25th anniversary in 2018. Nice. And had a chance to be back there to give the keynote address to everybody, which was amazing to see that organization come 25 years past when we began.
Yeah. Yeah.
So over the last few years, I've had less involvement and actually no involvement in the day-to-day operations.
Okay. And so what was it like when if you go back to, because the fitness industry is pretty young, right? It's a relatively young industry. When you look at when, CPTN, when Canfit Pro, even when like big box gyms started in Canada with regards to, Good Life probably being one of the first, uh, there's been a lot of research over these past several years. So what was it like back then when you were first starting to develop the programs, as you said, the standards, the examinations? What was it like then when you were coming up with all that, and what was that process like walking through the development?
Well, we started with an information session, or more of it wasn't a workshop, it was a little bit of a lecture series, and two or three of us actually spoke in terms of the state of the industry and what things were looking like, within Canada in terms of providing, personal training services. And there was a dearth in terms of education. There was a dearth in terms of connection and actually, a unified, agreed upon level of standards that would enable people to confidently become personal trainers. So that's where we started with that initial sort of info session. And out of that, Susan Lee, who is a phenomenal individual, approached Lucinda Christian at the time. Her name is Lucinda Jensen now, and myself, to start working on this association with the end goal of not necessarily certification, but the end goal was to try and help to educate personal trainers. And then we went down the road of certification as a means to an end to help with the education process. But again, at the center, at the focal point, it is about education and education, educating personal trainers across Canada.
Yeah, and that's a lot of what like the company that I started. What I do, I used to work at Canfit Pro when we were redoing the personal training certification there, and then I kind of broke out on my own. And I obviously teach at Centennial, taught at Laurier for a couple of years, and so I just started developing education specifically in that realm of the individual who comes out of rehab into a personal training space, and what a trainer can then do to help that person, coordinating with physiotherapists, occupational therapists, even osteopaths, chiros, massage therapists, to try to get the best out of that client without kind of stepping on feet or without making them worse. Because there isn't a lot of the personal training certifications on things like that. And so it's been what we found really, really useful for a lot of trainers in there. Now, you mentioned unity as kind of being kind of one of those big pieces that you were looking at, is that there was maybe different camps all over the place. I know that every province had their own kind of certifying agency that was kind of over, like looking over everything. They were kind of in control of what was going on. A lot of them still have their own certifications. And so what did you do in order to kind of connect all those different, I guess, stakeholders in the fitness industry within Canada at that time?
We did travel across the country. We also approached individuals at different institutions out east and out west to try and bring on board people who are already educators in the field, to approach them about becoming practical assessors, and then approach them about becoming course conductors. And I will admit that the CPTN is still very Ontario centric. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, it's not necessarily looking at the specific certification. I will absolutely promote the CPTN, and I have a bias, and I admitted bias in terms of helping to develop it. I think it's much more an issue and a challenge of the continuing education that goes on beyond the certification. Yeah. So the one thing that very adamant about and happy to always promote too is the annual conference. Yeah. So having the annual conference, which was virtual, very much like all of our conferences are now over the last 4 months and foreseeable future, but to be able to have that outlet in terms of the education and the continuing the education is critical.
Yeah. And so when did that happen? When was that conference?
It was just this past spring.
Okay, nice. And you said, is it always virtual?
First
Or is
time.
it first time?
It was the first time
Yeah. And then where do you guys typically hold that conference?
in Toronto.
In Toronto? Awesome. Yeah. So we'll try to link to that at the end when we kind of go over some ways that people can stay in contact with you and get some more education, because I think that's truly valuable, is going to conferences. I still go to conferences all over North America, perform better in the States a lot. I'm often here because I live in Toronto. I'm often here at, CanFit Pro and that kind of thing. So I'm always in different areas looking for that. So I have a question that's kind of a little bit, it wasn't in our topic guide, but I just want to see your thoughts on it. Uh, the fitness industry within Canada and even the US, it isn't something that is regulated. So it's not something that has a like one overseeing governing body. It doesn't have a standardized test that people need to take. And I always kind of look at a place like Australia, which has done really, really well and has been really successful with something like that. Do you think, one, that is something that is in the future of the fitness industry within Canada, US, North America? Um, and do you see it as something that is necessary for us?
So your first question, I don't see it in the near future, foreseeable future, simply because of provincial, I mean, distinction between provincial needs and guidelines and federal needs and guidelines. And if you're looking at an accreditation or an organization that is either accredited or, not unlike the massage therapy, they're all provincial. So I
Yeah.
see that as a possibility. I don't necessarily see one universal coast to coast national.
Okay.
And in terms of your second question, I think it is because of the territorial natures that each province does have specific needs. So again, that would probably be the reason why.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, so let's kind of get into a little bit about what you've seen. So, since the beginning of your time, you've been a coach, trainer, strength and conditioning specialist since for about 30 years or so, I believe you mentioned. So, what have you seen as the biggest changes from then until now in the industry itself?
When my business partner and I, so my business partner, Barry Shepley, phenomenal individual, great friend. We've been into, together in business for 30 years. So when we first started our company, the inclination, we were faxing our training programs. And that's the way we remotely coached with individuals.
Yeah.
So I would say the biggest change over the last 30 years is certainly being technology. And I would say that when we got started, the preeminent wearable technology was a heart rate monitor.
Yeah.
And if we look at the URSA report, even just 2 or 3 years ago, wearable technology was one either first or second biggest trend. And we've seen the growth, the expansion, the evolution of technology, and specifically wearable technology, as being unbelievable over the last 30 years. So I would say it is technology for sure. That's
Yeah.
been the biggest change.
Yeah, and I've had a few guests on the podcast state that as well, that they've seen just a drastic increase in not only what they've seen kind of come out with regards to wearable technology, but also the application of it if it's done properly. And it's some of the things that we are talking about, we were discussing, we're a couple years away with kind of being able to do things, but and there's some privacy stuff with it, but being able to get that in can be hugely valuable. So how have you used technology in your job right now with what you do? How have you been using or leveraging technology?
Yeah, again, so I mentioned that we started using fax machines, and we still, a staple of our business is remote coaching support. So we've switched out, I mean, what we do is still the same, the tools we use are different. So
Mm-hmm.
we now use an online platform, and there are dozens of online platforms to be able to coach and track and monitor the athletes that we're working with. So uh, we are still doing very much the same thing. It's just a matter of doing it with a different tool.
Mm-hmm. And with regards to, because you've had a lot of experience working with Olympic athletes, right? So what has been your experience? Been kind of the biggest lessons that you've learned while working with athletes, like Olympic athletes, the highest level in each of their fields? What are the kind of some of the biggest things that you've learned from working with them?
I'm extremely fortunate in terms of the work I do within high performance sport. Yes, I am working with national team athletes and Olympians, and the work I do with my company, one of our divisions is within the corporate world. So I've had the honor of working with not only Olympians but also um, Olympic class executives.
Oh,
And I would say, I mean, they typically are the same. I mean, they're people, but their objectives and goals are clear.
hmm,
So they have a clear understanding of what success looks like. I mean, it's easy at an Olympic Games. You either finish first or you don't. That there's a very quantifiable measure. But it's similar in terms of the executives that I work with. They have a very clear understanding of what success looks like. And they're all extremely highly driven people,
hmm,
but they're people. So again, it's about setting your objectives, it's setting your goals, it's creating the roadmap to help achieve or attain those goals. So again, I think one of the massive distinctions, whether it's the Olympic athlete or the corporate executive, is they're very driven.
yeah. I've worked with a few professional athletes in some of the big sports, so NHL, NFL, some European soccer athletes, and it's been interesting because, like, as I've progressed through, I originally wanted to go and become a physio or a chiro, working in a clinic, and because I just loved the rehab aspect of training. But then when I got into the clinic, I realized I'm like, a lot of these people at the kind of the general population, a lot of them actually don't want to get better or aren't willing to put in the work to get better. So I'm like, well, maybe I'll go athlete. So I went to the opposite end of the spectrum to high level athletes. And it was actually very interesting to me. There were certain athletes, as you said, in these sports. Now, I haven't trained Olympic athletes, so this is where I'm going to ask for your kind of your expertise. But there were certain athletes that were really, they loved being in the gym. They loved being there, getting the result and doing that. But then there was others who are so highly skilled. They're like, I'm being paid X amount of money and I don't want to be here. I'm here because I kind of have to, because, my team, my trainers, my rehab staff told me I had to be in the gym. So that's then why I'm here. And so you see this very differing level. But then you look at something like an Olympic athlete who doesn't necessarily make, X million dollars per year. Their games are every 4 years, and then they have, the world championships and that kind of stuff in between. But have you had that same experience with other professional athletes outside of the Olympics?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I have. And again, I would say the distinctions are most of the Olympic athletes that I've worked with have to peak two, maybe three times a year.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, I have experience in coaching rugby, for example, and rugby athletes, whether it's provincial, nationals, and in some cases, they actually have to peak every weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a massive distinction in terms of creating their yearly training plans and their programs with focus. So another example would be triathlon. I think triathlon is a really good example of a sport that touches everybody at every level, at every age, all genders, all physical abilities. And when you look at a triathlon race, you could have a world champion or an Olympian competing on the same course on the same day as the 50-year-old mom or dad, or even a 60-year-old world champion. So I think triathlon is one of those great examples where you touch every end of the spectrum within sport, and also the sort of level of athlete that you're working with.
Yeah. So when it comes to motivation, then, so a lot of, most Olympic athletes, or as you said, the corporate executives are very internally driven. They're very self-motivating people. They, as you said, they know what success looks like. And so they're consistently driving towards that. there's always lulls even in that kind of mindset. There's always ups and downs. There's days that you don't really feel like it. There's days that feel really good. How do you really work, because you also work virtually as well, so you can touch on that as well, but how do you work to maintain a motivation over several years with ups and downs with the clients that you work with?
I think it's important to acknowledge that everybody is going to have ups and downs, and not to focus or fixate on the areas where you're going through down periods. And I think it's critical to actually map out what a year looks like, understanding that the year is going to change based on needs, based on kids, based on work, based on family commitments. But if you have that mapped out, so for example, if I'm working with a university rugby player, when are your exams? It's unrealistic for us to expect to go through a loading phase during your exam. So that's going to be your unloading phase. You're going to work out less frequent, but I think it starts with having a plan,
Yeah.
but then being able to pivot and modify, and being nimble and flexible to modify the plan. I think one critical component is actually being able to monitor the adaptations of the training that's occurring. So a few things that I'm fairly adamant about people tracking that I work with are, their quality of sleep, their morning resting heart rate, their mood, how they're feeling. I think having at least one or two physiological metrics, whether it's resting heart rate or heart rate variability, and one or two psychological metrics are absolutely key in understanding when you need to take the downtimes, and if things are going askew or astray, being able to pivot immediately based on that. So again, it's not only creating the programs and modifying those programs, it's about being able to monitor the adaptations to the training under the programs.
So with that, when you're looking at monitoring, I'm assuming this isn't just with high level athletes, this is with most of the clients that you work with, you're trying to monitor both the psychological and physiological aspects of sleep and heart rate variability, as you mentioned. How do you rely on them to track all of that and then let you know what it is? Do they have a sheet every week that they fill out and send to you? How do you help them monitor that?
The onus is upon the individual, and it's an agreement or an understanding that we have at the outset of beginning the coaching relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of wearable technology now that is available does absolutely make it a lot easier than it was 30 years ago. So quite honestly, 30 years ago, it was pen and paper. Then it moved to Excel. Now it's all wearable technology that is almost uploaded immediately. So a lot of the athletes that I work with will either have a Whoop strap or a Garmin that uploads information automatically. Nice. But still, the onus is upon the individual to track.
Mm-hmm. So what's that Whoop strap? I actually haven't heard of that one before.
Again, it's a similar thing to what a Fitbit would be, and it just gives you sort of measures, like your heart rate variability, resting heart rate, things of that nature, hours of sleep, restful sleep, solid sleep. So it's a wearable technology.
Yeah, and then so when adapting training to that, what are the specific indicators that you're looking for within, like, let's stick with physiological, we'll get the psychological in a bit, but within the physiological things that you're tracking, what are you really monitoring for? And then how do you modify their program for that in response to what you're seeing?
Okay, we're going to get down into the weeds a little bit here. That's a really good question. So I'll use an athlete as an example. What I will do is we will calculate what normal looks like for that individual, and it might require several weeks or months. Now it has to be periods where there's consistent, steady training, no competitions, no sickness, no illness. Stress has to be at a manageable level. So quote unquote the normal state or the normal status. So then based on that, what I do with each of the metrics, and some people will keep track of 2, maybe 3 metrics. Some people will keep track of 7, 8, 9 metrics. What I'll do is I'll look at their Z scores, or I'll look at what the standard deviation is of each one of those metrics. And if it falls outside of what's expected, then with the system that I'm using, it'll be, we'll be able to red flag it or yellow flag it. Now, when there are multiple days of yellow flags, then it becomes red flag. But the point is, we're addressing this well before we ever get red flag indication. So it really comes down to understanding the individual, because everybody's range, their means, their standard deviations are going to be completely individualized with each of the metrics that you're taking. But that is necessary in order to compare during stressful periods or stressful times.
Mhm. And then with regards to the training itself, what will you then, is it simply when they're in the yellow, you kind of dial back training a little bit, maybe add a couple extra rest days in there? Or, when it's a red flag, are you kind of getting, okay, we got to have some recovery days in here for the next few days to kind of bring things back down? Like what kind of things are you doing to help manage that?
Yeah, again, it depends on the individual. For example, being in a yellow zone might be expected based on the annual plan that we've created, and it's a loading phase. So, you have the conversation with the athlete prior to that you are going to be tired next week. These numbers are going to be higher. This is expected. Okay. If it's unexpected, and it's unexpected for 1, 2, 3, usually if it's one day, I'll reach out and say, hey, what's up? You okay? And then it might be. I'll give you a perfect example. So 2 weeks ago, one of the athletes that I work with, and I've been coaching. I used to coach her brother, who was an Olympian, two-time Olympian, and I'm coaching her now. And for about 8 years, she had a mouse in her room, and her sleep quality was off. So I contacted her, the next day. What's up? Your sleep quality is a little off, and she explained to me, she had a heart attack because a mouse woke her up. So in that case, there's no need to modify training. But I think it's just a matter of being on top of things and not waiting for things to cascade. I mean, the only value in monitoring and using monitoring data is if it's actually there is a temporal or a time component involved. You can't look at these things a week or two later and try and do a retrospective analysis. You simply just need to be on top of it. So I think just having the ability to recognize, hey, what's up? Oh, okay. Okay. Did you catch the mouse? She did. She caught the mouse. You set a trap, caught it the next day, and she slept peacefully
Yeah.
after that. So I think it's just a matter of being on top of things.
And what program do you use for tracking all of that? 'Cause you said it goes directly in and then you can see the flags almost right away. What program do you use for that?
Been using, my business partner and I have been using Training Peaks for about
Okay.
15 years.
Okay. And then you find that's the best one that you've used?
The majority of the athletes that we work with as a company are triathletes, marathoners, endurance athletes. So I would say Training Peaks is a really good program if you are working with a lot of endurance athletes.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm trying to think about because obviously tracking that stuff is really important. It's something that isn't done all that well with the general population in the regular gym. Most people aren't doing that, but I'll see what you think about this. So I was having a conversation with a good friend of mine, Michael Kuniko, who's from Australia. He's the head of Fitness First for PT in Australia. And, he was talking about, developing things and saying, hey, if you're going to you're going to sell a program, like a personalized program for an individual, tack on, the 100, 200, $300 it's going to cost to get them a Garmin or get them, a Fitbit or something like that, so that they can start tracking that. So you have those numbers and just tack it, like you give it to them. And it's almost like it's a gift because they've already paid for it. They maybe didn't know that was part of the price already, but then giving that to them. Do you rely on your athletes to have those, or do you do something like that?
I do, but I leave that up to them. So there are, over a dozen of different types of tools that you can use, all of which, and there is a list. So Training Peaks, for example, does have on their website the wearable technology that interfaces smoothly with their product. So that's what I would absolutely recommend.
Awesome. So can you walk me through the current business that you have? So PB Health and Performance, as you said, you're co-owner of that. Where did that come from? How long have you been working in that kind of realm? And what do you, is it only athletes and corporate, or do you work with just about everybody? in that.
Yeah, we work with anybody who's willing to work with us. Yeah, absolutely. So again, Barry and I, Barry Shepley is he's actually he was the Olympic triathlon coach in 2000, and has been a national team coach for years. I mean, if you're looking at triathlon coaching and sort of knowledge and evolution, there, Barry's the guy to speak to for sure.
Mhm.
So we met at university, and we were both at the time working with a different company that was focused solely on the corporate end of things. And then Barry and I were the ones within that corporate world who were responsible for the testing of employees and doing the physical testing. They decided not to do that anymore. So Barry and I were fired, and sitting around, struggling, starving, just finished university, figuring out what are we going to do. So we figured out, you know what, the tail end of a recession, so probably not the best time to start a company, but we decided to go on our own and open our own company. So what we also found out, we knew, is one of the corporate clients of this company that we worked with, their contract with our former employers was coming to an end.
Mm.
So they put out an RFP, a request for proposal, to manage their corporate center. Barry and I put in a proposal, and we actually won the contract. And we had that corporate client for 19 years, 20 years, and that really started our corporate division, which enabled to help subsidize our coaching division.
Yeah.
And again, the third division with our company is we actually run camps and events across Canada, across the U.S. And every 2 or 3 years, we'll take, 20, 30, 40, 70 people to an Ironman triathlon. So the way our three divisions of our company work, they work really well together. And it all started with us, being fired. And we celebrate the day. It's October 15th.
Yeah.
We call it PB Liberation Day.
Nice.
And we always, and I still have that termination letter, because it was the best possible thing for, giving Barry and I a kick in the pants to try and go on our own. And that was, that was 30 years ago, coming next year.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah. Starting in a recession is probably never the best idea when it comes to starting a new company, venturing out on your own. But then again, if everybody else is in a recession, it might be the best time to, take it slow, kind of build it up. And then when everything comes out, you're beyond that. Right. So I want to switch gears a little bit and get into your experience working kind of as the director of sports science and sport medicine at the Canadian Sport Institute in Ontario. And so what did that role, because that's a big, long title, what did your role there encompass? What were you responsible for?
Sure. So again, that started in around 1999 as a strength and conditioning coach, as an external provider. And then over, I guess it was 6 years ago, became a little more involved. It used to be called the National Sports Centre Toronto. Then it changed to the Canadian Sports Centre Ontario. And then just before the Pan Am Games, it changed to the Canadian Sport Institute. So the roles that I've been, and it's an amazing place to be able to work with, because there's some phenomenally smart people. And I like that always, I'm always hanging around with people way smarter than me, which is amazing, because that's the way that I learn. But there are really some phenomenal people there, from the CEO all the way down to, every single practitioner. So the roles that I've been privileged to fulfill at the CSIO is I have been a strength and conditioning coach. So I was the lead strength and conditioning coach as well. I was the manager of performance services. I was the director of sports science and sports medicine. I was the lead of sports science, overseeing physiology and biomechanics. And now, most recently, I'm a senior advisor. So in terms of the work that I do, I still have the opportunity to work and coach some athletes, which is huge. But I also have the opportunity to mentor and be mentored by a number of individuals. So I think it's just it's a wonderful place to be able to work, and it's a wonderful place to be able to be involved if you're interested in high performance sport within Canada.
Yeah, and you I know I have a friend who works there, and I think he's actually part of your advisory board for the CSCA, Ryan McDonald. So RMAC, as we call him. Yeah. So I know that you guys have some really cool tools there in the gym. And like the one that I saw was basically an eccentric loading machine. And it was very, very interesting. So this was before, like this is a while ago. I can't remember how long ago it was when you guys got that, but that was kind of before I really got into understanding the role, the importance of eccentric loading and eccentric training for athletes, for performance, for injury rehabilitation, injury prevention. What kind of things do you guys have there? Because I know everything when it comes to the Olympics is kind of getting that little bit further, that one step further. So what kind of tools and tricks do you guys have, if you can actually tell me, at the CSI that you guys utilize with your athletes?
Yeah, sure. And Ryan McDonald's a perfect example of a guy who's way smarter than me, and I love hanging around him for sure.
Yeah,
he's awesome, and the work that he's done with beach volleyball has been incredible over the last couple of years. So that tool that you're talking about was the IM Lifter. We actually have since sold it, so we don't have it on the floor anymore. But in terms of some of the things we have in the lab, we do have a DEXA scanner. We do have 3 metabolic carts and doing a lot of physiological testing in terms of VO2 max and step tests. Force plates are something that we're integrating more and more often and more on a regular basis, and not necessarily just for testing. But even looking and utilizing that as a readiness tool, and Ryan has been actually phenomenal. We do have, velocity-based tools that we're using as well. But let me say that the tools should not be the focal point. Coaching needs to be the focal point, and how we interact and how we work with the athletes, regardless of the tools, has to still be the focus.
Yeah. And when it comes to, because you mentioned force plates. So just for those who maybe don't know how you would utilize that in an actual training program, can you just explain to the audience like how you guys utilize that to track whether it be differences in pushing a little bit more, maybe in a squat with the right leg versus the left, those types of things? How do you guys use those in your training?
So there are a number of things that you can use it for. So you can look at vertical jump, whether you're doing a squat jump or a counter movement jump. You can look at the rate of force development. You can look at flight time. So again, there are a number of different things, and I think it depends on, and here's why tools can't be the focal point. It depends on what the objectives are of the coach in being able to utilize the program. So, one of the sports that works at the institute is diving, and it's not necessarily having a higher vertical that they're interested in. Looking at the force plate, what their coach is interested in more so than a higher vertical is actually looking at how quickly they rotate. So in that case, you might use IMU or vertical displacement units to be able to look at that. So there are a number of different uses for force plates, and I think it really depends on what the objective is of the program and what the objectives of the coach and the goals of the program.
Yeah. And then, so how do you see the difference between programming for a Olympic athlete, other than just the length of the periodization that you have to do with them? But how is the programming different for like an Olympic athlete versus, one of your corporate execs or the general population?
Not a lot of differences. To be quite honest, you still have the planning session. We'll still look at creating the annual program. We'll still look at, the modifications that need to take place based on, life that occurs. So to be quite honest, there's not a lot of difference. The processes that I'll use and that are in place are very much identical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's I'm glad that you said that, because there's a lot of new trainers, even experienced trainers who train people very, very differently. Like think that the training a high level athlete is so much different than training a somebody who's in general population wants to maybe put on a little bit of muscle mass, right? That's their goal. The goal is kind of aesthetics, and I agree. There are some slight differences, but you're still looking at all the same, kind of metrics. You're still looking at kind of the stresses that the person is being put under, both, as you mentioned, psychologically and physiologically, trying to get kind of the bigger picture. And they're both trying to achieve a goal. The goals are just different, and then the programming then reflects the goal. So can we go through a little bit about I want to discuss a little bit about how you help your Olympic athletes peak, because as you mentioned, rugby Olympic athletes very, very different in how they what they need to prepare for. Olympic athlete is 3-4 times a year maybe they have to peak, and then continue building for that fourth year where they've got the actual Olympic games themselves. And then you've got somebody who's maybe a rugby player who, as you mentioned, has to maybe peak every week, maybe twice a week if they're playing a couple games a week. How do you go about assisting those two very, very different clients in peaking for those specific events?
It starts with the conversation with the coach in terms of prioritization. And we do have trials and training camps that will lead into the competitions in terms of what we need to do for their peaking and their tapering. And to be quite honest, Adam, it's extremely individually based on the individuals. And I mean, some athletes will need to have a slow decay taper. Some athletes might need to have a slightly faster. And I think it also depends on what sport they're involved with, though. I know typically an endurance athlete that I'm working with will have a longer taper than an anaerobic power athlete. So very individualized for sure.
Mhm. And then how do you manage that, those tapers, the deload phases with different athletes? How do you organize those outside of having, maybe a yellow flag or a red flag? How do you do that in the actual training program, whether it's a rugby athlete from season to season, in season to off season, or with a Olympic athlete after a trial?
Well, again, you need to be able to tracking, training load and how the training load both within their sport and off the playground, essentially in the DTE is impacting them and affecting them. So again, that has to happen by looking at the monitoring data. It has to happen with data and analysis of that data. So it can't be a guessing work in terms of the load. So again, the one thing that we'll do for sure is we are tracking what loads they're undergoing.
Mm-hmm. And do you track, I'm assuming you track your in-game or in-competition metrics as well to see how much stress they're going in or going through. So, if you've got a rugby athlete who, with regards to the distance that they've ran, do you track all of that as well for those athletes?
Again, yeah, for some we do for sure. For some sports, no. So Chris Robertson, who is working, he's the S&C coach with rugby, does a phenomenal job of that. But again, there's been an evolution over the last 3 years in being able to get to the point of and I think of somebody like Adam Douglas with Hockey Canada, who does a phenomenal job with tracking some of that volume. And it's because of the wearable technology that he has access to and he's able to utilize.
Awesome. So, how has this pandemic influenced the training of the athletes that you work, the Olympic athletes that you work with?
Very fortunate in that we already, again, my business partner and I, and we've already had in place the tools to be able to coach remotely.
Mm-hmm.
And I can think, so two of the athletes, for example, that I work with, one moved immediately to Finland, another one moved immediately to Barbados. But they typically travel around the world in normal circumstances. So again, for the majority of the individuals that I work with, it has not impacted it greatly.
Mm.
In terms of the DTE and getting into the facility, again, we were able to provide online support, being able to utilize, I mean, you, I'm sure as well, have had an exponential increase in the amount of Zoom meetings that you've had. So being able
Yeah.
to use these tools have enhanced it. But fortunately, in my circumstances, in my situation, it was remote coaching and remote support is already something that we had in place.
Yeah. How often do you communicate with your clients and your athletes? Is it daily? Is it, I'm assuming it's every week, but is it this daily thing that you're constantly checking in with them, or is it only if there's kind of something coming up?
Some are daily, some are weekly, and some are monthly. So
Okay.
like it depends on, and that's the types of conversations that we'll have at the outset in terms of the desired frequency and also the desired tool that we're going to be communicating with. So again, that's similarly, and I do believe that should also be individually, sort of established based on what the needs are of the individuals that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. And so have you done any with, like, so you mentioned that you were already set up for a lot of online, a lot of virtual training, being able to do that because your company was already doing a lot of that already. And as you mentioned, a lot of the athletes travel around in the year anyways. Have you had any instances where you've had to do some problem solving with regards to either getting different tools or tools that they maybe didn't have in the location where they were that you had to kind of adapt? Because I know people who were trying to get equipment who couldn't get equipment, and there's a big shortage of that. Just seeing if you guys had to do anything like that.
Absolutely, and I credit the ingenuity of some of the athletes that I work with in creating, some cables and pulleys with cinder blocks and things of that nature. So what I did, in that particular case, I asked them to make sure to send me pictures and video to make sure that it's actually safe
Yeah.
first and foremost. But no, absolutely, that is certainly being part of it. And I mean, another athlete. One of the things, because not able to get into the gym where he was at, was doing here's your workout, and your entire workout is the focal point is the park bench at the park. So you've got the park bench and you've got that chin up bar on the monkeys,
Yeah.
the monkey set. So, and that's your workout. So absolutely. But again, a lot to do with the ingenuity of the individual that I'm working with.
Yeah, that's a great thing about working with athletes who not only know their body really, really well, but also understand I guess, the ideas behind how to create things out of nothing to get, whatever they need out of it, right? Being able to do that, because I know for me, that's one of the things that I love as a trainer, a strength and conditioning coach, as a guy working in clinics and rehab. Being able to modify for me is like, it gets me giddy. Like, it gets me some goosebumps when I'm like, oh, we got a problem solve like that. That to me, I love that. I love the problem solving side of things. Are you the same way? Maybe you don't
Well,
get near as
absolutely,
giddy,
but
but
again, and that sort of hammers home a point that we talked about previously in terms of already having the monitoring pieces in place.
yeah.
So so you're having an understanding. The volume is quite significantly lower. The tool in the vehicle is different. So how is what's the adaptation in the next day or two, and then you'd be able to progress from there. So
Mhm.
again, it's so critical to have the monitoring tools in place.
And I actually want to talk about that. So you mentioned the adaptation. So I love when people talk about tools or they get married to a tool, right? So specifically, like, maybe not so much in something like training Olympic athletes, but when you go into a big box gym, you've got people that go to a course, maybe it's a TRX course or a kettlebell course, and then all of a sudden everything that they do is a kettlebell or a TRX, and they become married to not only one way of training but specific tools as well as being the thing that gets the job done. And while I do like tools. I see them, I think, as you do, as just a way to get the adaptation that we're looking for. It's not necessarily that a dumbbell, kettlebell, barbell is like you have to have one or the other, but while they each have positives and negatives for different adaptations that we're looking for, the adaptation is what we have to be evaluating, right? How is their body actually how is their body actually adapting to the stresses that we're putting on it? And so, in addition to the tracking that you already do, kind of the daily thing to find your flags, how are you tracking the adaptations that you're looking for? And then how do you modify a program, or how often do I guess reevaluate a program based off of the adaptations that you were either seeing or not seeing?
Yeah, so the evaluation of the program typically happens on a weekly basis. In some cases, if the athletes want the monthly touch points, then it'll happen on a monthly basis, and we'll evaluate what's happened. But again, it's dependent upon the individual. But I also employ a number of field tests. So what's the tool that you have? So some of the athletes that I work with have an erg, a rowing erg. So what's your 1K or what's your 2K time for that particular mode of activity? So again, another athlete that I'm working with who's a boxer, she does a 5-minute skip test. So again, I think it depends on the individual as well, and what their focus is, what their objectives are, what their goals are.
Yeah, and so a lot of that is based off of the tool that the client has. And then do you have preferences to tools that you would like a specific client to have available for testing? Or do you just work with whatever the client actually has available to them?
Yeah, the latter. So it's a conversation in terms of what you actually prefer, because again, the few things involved in that. If it's something they have access to, is something they enjoy, then the compliance and utilization is actually going to be higher as well.
Mm-hmm. And then do you see a big transfer when you look at, for example, a rowing machine versus a bike versus skipping, as an example? Where do you kind of come on the specificity of the tool that we're using, and then its transferability into the sport or the athletic event that athlete is actually engaged in?
Well, I'm a big fan and a big proponent of cross training, using multiple modes of activities as much as possible. And even the elite marathoners that I've coached over the years, rarely will I have them run more than 4 times a week. I can think of actually only 2 examples of marathoners that have run more than 4 times a week. But in other cases, I am actually getting them into a pool to do some running in the water, or they are getting in, onto the bike to be able to utilize that as a mode to improve their central system, their central cardiovascular system. So I'm a huge proponent of being able to cross train.
Yeah.
And again, that starts from my business partner and I've always had that philosophy, and I think it really started because of being able to work with triathletes. That was an inherent part of that sport.
Yeah, because they're doing 3 different activities in the actual sport itself, right? So, can you just walk us through the neural and the kind of the central adaptations that occur when it comes to cross training, specifically for an endurance athlete?
Sure. I mean, your central system. So if we're looking, and I'm going to boil it down, sort of basics. So your central system, let's say heart and lungs are really dumb and don't know what mode of activity you're using. Your peripheral system, when you're talking about getting to your extremities and looking at things like capillarization at the muscle level, or mitochondrial density, that your peripheral system more so knows what type of activity you're doing. So in terms of a general adaptation phase, a marathon runner can get some benefits from biking, improving a central system. However, in order to be a faster marathoner, you need to run, you need to do intervals, you need to do mile repeats, and that's focused more on your peripheral system. So I think having an understanding of balancing the two
Yeah.
And also looking at the incidence of injuries. When you're doing a needs analysis of a sport, you always need to look at the incidence of injuries and sort of the percentages of where they occur, and be able to prescribe your program based on that. So, I mean, if you're looking at triathlon research, depending on what paper you're looking at, triathletes are typically dealing with chronic, 75 to up to 90% of triathletes are actually competing while dealing with an injury.
Yeah.
Because of overload, because of doing too much training in one mode or one activity. So having the ability to cross train, having the ability to periodize that over time is absolutely critical.
Yeah. And so when it comes to the central and the peripheral systems, can you is it the nervous system that we're looking at within the peripheral system, or are we still just looking at the cardiovascular system as knowing what you're doing?
Yeah, you're still looking at your cardiovascular, central and peripheral system. Your nervous system and your neuromuscular system is going to be is again, it's a different system. But when you are talking about being specific, yes, your neuromuscular system becomes more efficient in doing a movement or an activity the more you do it. So again, there is a learning. You are creating those motor engrams. You are creating that. Rather than motor engrams, I'll say muscle memory. So you are creating that when you are going through training.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always fascinated with because I completely agree. Like, with a lot of hockey players that I've worked with, very rarely do I actually have them, skating and doing a lot of like cardio on the ice until we get closer to the actual season or the preseason. So they're still on the ice once or twice a week, but they're doing skating, they're practicing edging, and they're, working on their shot, those types of things. And then, we're doing a lot of other kind of lower impact activities, such as you said, biking, running in the water, those types of things, even just going for a hike or a jog through the woods, something like that there's constant changes. So when you go through a run through the woods on a trail, right, especially if you're in the mountains, if you're out west, you're running and you're actually chopping almost side to side using the same kind of action, but your body has to respond now with the ankle. So I've used that with a lot of athletes for a long time in order to, as I said, prevent that overload from them using, because they think, okay, I play hockey. I got to play hockey all year round, all the time, 5 days a week, go hard. But for injury prevention, for overuse of all those tissues, right? Probably not the best idea in the world.
Well, I mean, you've just alluded to it without specifically saying it, just being able to have a mental, emotional break from the grind of a hockey season too, and being able to get out on the trail is nice for the for sort of the psychological well-being as well.
Yeah, which is a big piece of all training, is that psychological component, right? So I actually think this is a great place to kind of finish part one, and we will pick it up in part two. State of the Industry Podcast.